Disclaimer: this video contains discussions of real criminal cases and sensitive subject matter. It is created for educational and documentary purposes only. Viewer discretion is advised. All individuals are presumed innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. She vanished into the dark, barefoot, alone, and only a few miles from safety. 1 minute, she was a bright young woman with dreams of grad school, laughter in her voice, and a future ahead of her. The next, she was gone, released into the night without her phone, her purse, or her car. And she would never be seen alive again. When her remains were found nearly a year later in a remote canyon, the question wasn't just what happened to Mitrice Richardson. It was how so many people failed her before the night ended. The story of Mitrice Richardson begins not with a crime, but with confusion, a series of small missteps that spiraled into a tragedy that still haunts Southern California. She was 24 years old, radiant, thoughtful, and endlessly curious. Friends described her as poetic and disciplined, a psychology graduate who wanted to study human behavior, not just in classrooms, but in life itself. She was close to her family, loved to dance, and had an energy that filled rooms. But on the evening of September 16, 2009, something seemed off. Mitrice drove along the Pacific Coast Highway toward Malibu, the sky fading into gold and violet. She stopped at a popular oceanfront restaurant known for its sweeping view and celebrity clientele. To everyone else there that night, it was an ordinary Wednesday. For Mitrice, it would be the last night anyone saw her alive. Witnesses said her behavior was erratic. She joined conversations with strangers, laughed at things no one else understood, and even left behind her wallet when it came time to pay the bill. The staff, unsure what to do, called the sheriff's department. Deputies arrived, spoke with her, and decided to take her into custody, not because she was violent, but because she couldn't pay for her meal. It was a minor misdemeanor, the kind that usually ends in a quick release or citation. At the Lost Hills Sheriff's Station, Mitrice was booked and processed. Deputies noted she seemed calm enough to be released. Her mother, who lived hours away, called the station and offered to pick her up in the morning, fearing the late night drive could be dangerous. But sometime after midnight, despite that warning, deputies made a decision that would forever change everything. They let Mitrice walk out of the station alone. She had no wallet, no phone, and no transportation. The surrounding area was pitch black, bordered by dense canyons and miles of wilderness. The only light came from the moon and a scattering of distant street lamps. The deputies said she seemed fine. But anyone who's ever stood on that lonely stretch of road after midnight knows how unforgiving it can be. Around 6 a.m., a homeowner in the nearby hills reported a strange figure wandering through their backyard. Young woman who matched Mitrice's description. Deputies responded but found nothing. It was the last credible sighting of her. Days turned into weeks. Her family, led by her mother, Lattice Sutton, began an agonizing search, posting flyers, organizing volunteer teams, and pleading for media attention. The sheriff's department conducted air and ground searches, but the canyon country is vast, full of deep ravines, steep terrain, and hidden gullies. Leads surfaced, a possible sighting in Venice Beach, another in Las Vegas, but none could be verified. Each false hope tore the family open again. Months passed, public frustration grew. People questioned how a young woman could vanish after being released from custody. Why wasn't she kept for her own safety? Why wasn't her mental state evaluated more carefully? Officials defended their decision, citing protocol, but for her family, those explanations were cold comfort against the silence of not knowing. Then, nearly 11 months later, on August 9, 2010, hikers in a remote part of Malibu Canyon stumbled upon a grim discovery: skeletal remains scattered among rocks in an area so isolated that few people ever passed through. The remains were identified as Mitrice Richardson, the official cause of death undetermined, no clear evidence of trauma, no answers about how she died, just a body returned from the wilderness and a family left with questions that time refused to solve. What happened in those hours after she left the station? Did she get lost, fall, or encounter someone dangerous? The canyon knows, but it keeps its secrets well. And while the sheriff's department maintains that her release followed procedure, her family's grief became a mission to change the policies that allowed their daughter to walk into the dark alone. Her death led to public outrage and eventually to a review of how the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department handles nighttime releases, especially involving vulnerable individuals. In a way, Mitrice's case forced the system to look at itself and to admit that by the book isn't always the same as doing what's right. But for her mother, no policy change can replace the loss of her daughter. To this day, she still visits the canyon, the last place Mitrice was known to be alive. Sometimes she leaves flowers, sometimes she just stands there and listens to the wind, hoping the earth might finally whisper back what it saw. Because behind all the headlines, behind the protests and lawsuits, is a truth that should never be forgotten. Mitrice Richardson wasn't just a case number. She was a daughter, a dreamer, a young woman who should have made it home that night. And every unanswered question still echoes through the canyons that kept her secret for nearly a year. In the months that followed the discovery of Mitrice Richardson's remains, grief turned into a quiet, relentless pursuit of truth. The canyon had given her back, but not her story. Her family wanted to know what had happened between the moment she left that sheriff's station and the moment her body was found nearly a year later in the wilderness. For most people, death brings finality, but for Mitrice's family it brought only more uncertainty. They questioned the investigation from the very beginning, the slow communication, the missing details, the inconsistencies. There were reports that her body was moved before the coroner arrived, breaking protocol. Critical evidence, if it existed, could have been lost. For a family already suffering, this wasn't just procedural failure. It felt like betrayal. Her mother, Lattice Sutton, refused to stay silent. She called news stations, wrote letters, and demanded accountability from the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department. She wanted someone to admit that releasing her daughter in the middle of the night, without transportation, without a phone, without shoes, was more than just a mistake. It was negligence. It was the moment everything began to unravel. But the system does not often confess its errors easily. Officials insisted Mitrice had seemed lucid. They said she showed no signs of distress and was therefore safe to be released. Yet those who knew her best said she wasn't herself that night. Her odd behavior at the restaurant, her rambling speech, it all suggested she was in the middle of a mental health crisis. A crisis that deserved compassion and intervention, not indifference and release into the dark. The more her family learned, the more troubling the picture became. The Lost Hills station had received her mother's call that night, a mother pleading with them not to release her daughter until morning. They acknowledged the call but chose to move forward anyway. It was a decision made in minutes, but it cost a lifetime of pain, and so the fight began. Public rallies formed. Advocates for mental health reform and police accountability gathered outside the sheriff's office holding signs that read, "Justice for Mitrice." Her story spread across the nation, shared on talk shows, true crime specials, and online forums. People who had never met her felt her story deep in their bones. A young woman failed not by one person, but by an entire system that couldn't see danger until it was too late. Still, the official cause of death remained undetermined. There was no evidence of foul play, the sheriff's department said. No visible injuries, no clear cause. The canyon, they suggested, was merciless terrain, hot during the day, cold at night, filled with wild animals and sharp ridges. Perhaps she wandered, became lost, disoriented, and succumbed to the elements, but the family wasn't convinced. The idea that she walked 11 miles barefoot into rugged wilderness didn't make sense. She was intelligent, physically fit, and knew the area's dangers. Something didn't add up. There were whispers of other possibilities, encounters with strangers, accidental falls, even the chance she was followed after leaving the station. Yet each theory ended the same way: speculation, uncertainty, silence. The canyon doesn't explain, it only swallows. In the aftermath, her parents pursued legal action against Los Angeles County. They argued that her release violated common sense safety measures and that the department failed in its duty of care. In 2011, they reached a settlement, but no amount of money could mend the wound left by unanswered questions. What mattered more to them was the change that came after. Because of Mitrice's case, new policies were introduced, guidelines that restricted the nighttime release of vulnerable individuals from custody. Now, if someone is mentally unwell, intoxicated, or without means of safe transportation, deputies must hold them until morning or until a responsible party arrives. In essence, her death rewrote the rules meant to protect others from the same fate. Her story became a catalyst for reform, a haunting reminder of what happens when empathy is replaced by bureaucracy. Still, reform couldn't erase the heartbreak. Lattice Sutton often returned to the mountains where her daughter was found. She would stand among the rocks and dry brush, staring into the canyon's endless silence. She'd speak aloud to Mitrice, as if her words might echo back through the ridges. She'd whisper that she was sorry, that she should have driven there that night. But deep down, she knew it wasn't her who failed. It was a system that refused to see humanity in its procedures. Even today, Mitrice's case remains a symbol of what can happen when mental health and law enforcement collide without understanding. It exposed the cracks in a system designed to protect, but too often forgets the people it serves. Her story is taught in law enforcement training, discussed in policy forums, and cited in debates about justice and care. She became more than a name in a file. She became a lesson written in loss. But for those who loved her, she's not a symbol, she's a person. Friends still remember her humor, her intelligence, her energy. They share stories of her spontaneous dances, her love of psychology, the way she'd analyze people and then make them laugh. They say she could find poetry in anything, even pain. And maybe that's the cruelest irony of all, that her life ended inside a tragedy she might have one day studied, written about, or helped prevent. The wilderness eventually quieted, but the world didn't forget. Documentaries, podcasts, and advocacy groups continue to tell her story, not for spectacle, but as a call to conscience. Every retelling is a warning wrapped in remembrance that procedures without empathy are dangerous, that safety without humanity isn't safety at all. Mitrice's death is not an unsolved mystery in the usual sense. There may never be a single answer that explains exactly what happened in those dark hours, but the why, the reason she was out there alone, barefoot in the cold, remains painfully clear. She was failed by a process that measured competence in checkboxes, not compassion. She was let go when she should have been kept safe. She was treated like a case file, not like a daughter, and though time has passed, her name still carries weight. Her story still echoes through those canyons, reminding everyone who listens that justice isn't always about prosecution. It's about prevention. It's about making sure no one else is abandoned in the same darkness. Because every person deserves to make it home, every mother deserves the peace of knowing her child is safe, and every system designed to serve people must remember that behind every booking number and policy line is a life that matters. The chilling death of Mitrice Richardson wasn't just a tragedy. It was a lesson. One written in sorrow, carved into the memory of a community, and carried forward by the very people who refused to let her name fade into silence. To Mitrice's loved ones, your loss changed policies, opened eyes, and continues to save lives. Her story will never be forgotten. May her memory remain a light for those still lost in the dark. Time has a cruel way of dulling headlines, but not pain. For most people, Mitrice Richardson's story became another unsolved tragedy that faded from the evening news. But for her family, especially her mother, it was a wound that never healed, a question that never stopped whispering, what really happened out there? In the years following the discovery of her remains, Lattice Sutton continued to press for answers. She retraced the official timeline, pored over documents, and spoke with journalists who would listen. Every interview, every camera, every public appearance was another attempt to keep Mitrice's name alive, to make sure her story didn't end in silence. She visited the Lost Hills Sheriff's Station, the same place where her daughter had been released, just to stand there and remember. She would look at the doors Mitrice walked out of that night, the very doors that opened not into freedom, but into the darkness that claimed her life. It wasn't just grief, it was disbelief. The disbelief that anyone could look at a young woman clearly in distress, release her barefoot at midnight and call it procedure. Inside the station, deputies had gone back to their routines. The world had moved on. But outside, the ghost of what happened lingered like a shadow stretching across the asphalt. In the years that followed, public interest in Mitrice's case reignited whenever new reports surfaced or anniversaries approached. Activists used her story to highlight a growing crisis, the intersection of mental health and law enforcement. Too often, they said, people experiencing psychological distress were treated as criminals or inconveniences instead of human beings in need of protection. What happened to Mitrice wasn't an isolated mistake. It was part of a pattern, a system more comfortable with procedure than empathy, more focused on paperwork than people. For the black community, her case also became a painful symbol of disparity. Many asked whether a young white woman, exhibiting the same confusion and distress, would have been treated differently. Would she have been held for observation? Would her family's pleas have been heard? Would she have been driven home rather than left to walk into the canyon alone? These weren't just rhetorical questions. They were mirrors held up to a system that often reflected injustice back at those who dared to look too closely. Malibu Canyon, where Mitrice's remains were found, is a place of brutal beauty. The hills are steep, the brush thick and unforgiving. It's a labyrinth of gullies, ravines, and dry creek beds where even seasoned hikers can lose their way. Coyotes prowl the night, and temperatures can drop sharply after dark. When deputies first reached the scene in August 2010, some questioned how her remains ended up there. The area was more than 7 miles from the sheriff's station, with no trails or direct roads leading in. Could she have wandered that far on foot? Could she have fallen or sought shelter and succumbed to exhaustion or dehydration? Others suggested the unthinkable, that someone else might have brought her there, that her disappearance wasn't an accident at all. But with time and weather erasing clues, and the condition of her remains offering no clear evidence of trauma, the mystery stayed locked inside those hills. The official verdict, undetermined, hung over the family like a cruel Answer: not murder, not accident, just unknown, and perhaps that's what made it hardest to bear, because unknown means there's no one to hold accountable, no one to point to, no one to blame but the silence. Lattice Sutton never accepted silence. Every year, she organized vigils and community events to honor her daughter's life. She worked with journalists, filmmakers, and advocacy groups to keep the story alive. Her persistence paid off. The case began appearing in documentaries and true crime investigations that exposed new audiences to Mitrice's tragedy. In those interviews, Lattice never spoke with bitterness, only conviction. Her grief became purpose. "I don't want revenge," she once said. "I want change," and change did come. Los Angeles County quietly revised its jail release policies, ensuring that no one in mental distress or anyone without access to safe transportation could be released at night without supervision or a responsible contact. It was a policy born from pain, a rule written in Mitrice's memory. To many, that was justice. To her mother, it was simply too late. Today, Mitrice Richardson's name stands among those whose stories forced the system to evolve. Her case is now studied in criminal justice programs, cited in discussions about ethics, policing, and public safety. She has become a symbol of the change that grief can ignite, a young woman whose death exposed flaws that might one day save someone else's life. But beyond the policies and headlines, her humanity remains the core of her story. She wasn't a symbol when she was alive. She was a daughter, a scholar, a dreamer, a woman who loved laughter, dancing, and the poetry of the human mind. Those who knew her remember her kindness, the way she made others feel seen. That's the irony of her death. The woman who made others feel visible was failed by a system that refused to truly see her. There's something haunting about the idea of walking into the unknown alone. The last moments of Mitrice Richardson's life will never be known, but they echo in the canyon winds that sweep through Malibu each night. Maybe she was searching for light, disoriented but hopeful that morning would come. Maybe she believed help wasn't far away. What's certain is this: she should never have been out there. Her story reminds us that safety is not just the absence of danger, it's the presence of care. And when care is missing, even the simplest night can turn deadly. Every time her name is spoken, it's a reminder that empathy saves lives, that every person, no matter their background, their state of mind, or their mistakes, deserves to be treated as someone's child, not someone's paperwork. The chilling death of Mitrice Richardson began as a case, but it became a movement, a call to do better, a plea for systems to remember their humanity before tragedy forces them to learn it. To the family and friends of Mitrice Richardson, your pain reshaped policy, your love sparked reform, and your persistence ensured that her story continues to protect others. Her life mattered, her name endures. May her memory light the path for every person still walking in the dark. There are stories that fade with time, and there are stories that refuse to die because they demand something from us. The story of Mitrice Richardson is one of those stories. It doesn't rest quietly in the archives of forgotten tragedy. It lingers, it asks, it presses. What could have been done differently? Even years later, her name carries a quiet power. Not because of mystery or conspiracy, but because of the human failure that allowed it to happen in the first place. After Mitrice's death, her mother, Lattice Sutton, refused to disappear into grief. Instead, she turned that pain into movement. She met with officials, spoke at conferences, and lobbied for transparency in the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department. She demanded access to logs, to call records, to internal memos from that night. She wanted to see the chain of decisions that led to her daughter's release, and to hold someone, anyone, accountable for them. But accountability is elusive when a system protects itself. What she encountered instead were redacted documents, incomplete explanations, and bureaucratic walls designed to exhaust those who seek the truth. Still, she didn't give up. She said she owed that to Mitrice, her only child, the bright and loving young woman who should have been studying psychology, not becoming a case study. In her interviews, Lattice's voice always trembled between strength and sorrow. She often said that justice wasn't about punishment, it was about prevention. She didn't want another mother to ever get the same phone call or the same silence, and slowly her fight started to matter. By 2013, several California counties, following Mitrice's case updated their jail release procedures. Now, anyone released at night must be offered a safe way home, a ride, or a shelter contact. If someone shows signs of mental distress, officers must consult mental health professionals before making the decision to release them. It sounds like common sense, but those policies only exist because a young woman once vanished into the dark, and her mother refused to let the world forget. Mitrice's story became part of law enforcement training material, an example of how procedural indifference can lead to irreversible tragedy. Her name was mentioned in city council meetings, in policy reform sessions, and in the offices of community advocates fighting for mental health awareness. Her legacy became a blueprint for compassion. Even today, people who visit Malibu Canyon sometimes stop at the area where Mitrice was found. Locals call it hauntingly beautiful, sunlight filtered through tall grass with the faint hum of wind against the ridges. To the unknowing eye, it's peaceful, but for those who remember her story, it's sacred ground. Every sound, the rustle of leaves, the echo of a hawk overhead, feels like part of an unfinished sentence. In that quiet, people reflect not just on how she died, but on how easily she could have been saved. One ride, one moment of compassion, one simple decision to wait until morning, and maybe, just maybe, Mitrice would still be here. The tragedy of Mitrice Richardson reveals something bigger than one case. It reveals the thin line between procedure and humanity. It shows how a policy made on paper can unravel a life in the real world. How following protocol can still lead to devastating consequences when empathy isn't part of the equation. Because systems don't fail in a single catastrophic moment. They fail quietly in the margins. They fail when a mother's plea is ignored, when a deputy assumes someone looks fine, when a form is signed instead of a question being asked. It's those tiny choices that ripple into forever. Her story reminds us that care is not a weakness, it's protection. And that every officer, every clerk, every person in power carries more responsibility than they sometimes realize, because every decision, no matter how small, can be the difference between life and death. More than a decade later, Mitrice Richardson's name still echoes in advocacy circles. Her face, bright, radiant, full of life, still appears on banners at vigils and awareness walks. Documentaries and podcasts continue to retell her story, not as entertainment, but as testimony. Because her story is no longer just about loss, it's about awareness. It's about the importance of treating mental health crises with compassion. It's about systemic reform, and most importantly, it's about seeing people, truly seeing them when they're at their most vulnerable. In Los Angeles County, some deputies still refer to her story when discussing nighttime releases. They call it the Mitrice Rule. It's not official, but it's understood. When in doubt, don't release them alone. If that phrase has saved even one life since 2009, then her story, in some small way, continues to protect others. Lattice Sutton still visits the canyon. She still leaves flowers, still speaks her daughter's name aloud, letting it travel through the wind and the hills. Sometimes she walks the same path that Mitrice might have taken that night, trying to feel what she might have felt, confused, scared, alone, but still moving forward. Every time she says the same prayer, that her daughter found peace before the end. In interviews, she often says she feels Mitrice's presence in the ocean breeze, in the sound of the waves near Malibu, in the laughter of strangers who remind her of her daughter's spirit. She's learned to live with a truth that has no conclusion, and to turn that pain into purpose. To her, Mitrice's story isn't about mystery anymore. It's about meaning. There's a phrase often repeated at memorials held for Mitrice Richardson: "She walked into the dark so others could see the light." It's not meant to romanticize tragedy. It's meant to honor the change born from it. Because her death sparked policies, awareness, and empathy that continue to ripple outward, her story is now taught in criminology and sociology programs, where students are asked to study not just what went wrong, but how systems can choose better. Better judgment, better compassion, better humanity. Each year, her mother organizes an event to honor her. Friends and supporters gather under candlelight, sharing stories and poems Mitrice once wrote. They talk about her love of psychology, her humor, her big heart. They cry, they laugh, and then they stand in silence, listening to the night, the same night that once took her away. But now, that night belongs to her memory. And in that memory there's light. To Mitrice's family, your courage turned tragedy into change. Your love ensured that her story did not end in darkness. May her memory continue to protect those who are vulnerable, and may the world never forget the lesson her life and death taught us all.